nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in the hood. I just told them be safe in the state.
Welcome to the Black Myths Podcast. Welcome to the Black Myths Podcast. I'm your host, Too Black. This is part 2 of the myth. It's easier to organize under Democrats. In part 1, we tried to evaluate this from different angles. So we just talked about the myth itself and how the argument doesn't really hold up and how lesser evil has become a philosophy more than it is a tactic. And therefore, no matter what, that is the default position that people take, no matter how heinous the lesser evil, the supposed lesser evil is. We dealt with what actually is organizing, because a lot of times this myth, people are throwing it around. It has nothing to do with actually organizing. It's just what makes people maybe feel more comfortable or feel like they have a little bit more space, regardless of what the facts are. And then we also try to analyze that historically, and what some of the markers and things that we might consider progressive or even radical, they sometimes happen under administrations that weren't Democrat, and sometimes they did happen under Democrats. But our overall point was that, the organizing should dictate elections, not elections or dictating organizing, and that it can be different under administrations, and that should be studied, but that's not equivalent to easier. So I would suggest people go back and listen to that episode. I'm not going to obviously redo it. So this episode today, we have a guest with us, Max Rameau. He's a Haitian-born Pan-Africanist, theorist, campaign strategist, movement scientist, and organizer. He is an organizer with Pan-African Community Action out in DC, and he recently wrote a paper called "Smash the Duopoly and Build Dual Power." And it goes into some of the questions that we brought up in our first episode, but just offers an assessment for those who are interested in thinking through the duopoly and how to deal with different administrations. And we also get into, we don't get as much time as I like, but we get into one of my favorite things called the MOST chart, which I use for organizing missions, objectives, strategies, and tactics. So we just we go through these questions. I think it was a good conversation, good interview. So I'm not going to say much more. Again, we fleshed out the foundational flaws of the myth, but this one we get to dig a bit more deeper, and I think kind of the structural underpinnings of how this myth gets perpetuated. So let's get into it. We'll be back. Be back again. Appreciate y'all, but let's go. All right, thank you. And you wrote a paper for Pan-African Community Action called "Smash the Duopoly and Build Dual Power," building dual power, or build dual power, excuse me. Before we get into the crux of the paper, just going to get your kind of take on this idea that it's easier to organize the Democrats or some of the other cousins of this phrase, picking your opponent, or you can hold their feet, get them in office and hold their feet to the fire, or we can open up more space by picking the weaker candidate, and these kind of slogans that are, in our opinion, souped up lesser evilism. Just want to get your opinion on that.
So yeah, these of course are popular things that go out. I find that they're mainly put out by organizations that get some kind of funding to do some kind of electoral work that usually gravitates towards, even if not endorsing, certainly gravitates around the Democratic Party. Just give two examples where I think that this is not true. That it's not easier, and I think I outlined it perfectly. Of course, that organizing is many things. So there are some ways in which you could say organizing is easier for some people under one type of administration versus other. So it's not a blanket statement, but I think if you were to do overall, if you think about the kind of social movements that were building up when George W. Bush was in office, those were growing. They were becoming more and more intense, certainly around the war in Iraq. and around all kinds of other things. And it really got bigger and bigger in some kind of ways around the housing crisis as it relates to domestic issues. If you remember, there was a major housing boom, which priced a lot of people out, and then there was a foreclosure a crisis where the global economy almost collapsed. And there was a lot of movement around that and blaming W. Bush for those things. But when Obama got in office, a lot of organizers, certainly those with more progressive or even radical positions, found it more difficult to organize under Obama because people did not blame Obama for those things in the way that they blamed George W. Bush for those things. People widely blame George W. Bush for invading Iraq and doing all kinds of dirt there, but people did not widely blame Barack Obama for destroying the country, the state of Libya, and for assassinating the president there. And people assumed that Barack Obama had good intentions when he contributed to the housing crisis, bailed out the big banks, things. They assumed he had good intentions in a way that they would not assume, I think, under George W. Bush. So in those ways, it's much more difficult to organize because to the extent that organizing does involve, one of the things you said, Too Black organizes, involves getting people motivated and to come out to do something. Mm-hmm. It was more difficult, certainly under Barack Obama, to motivate people to do that because they were like, you know what, he's got it. He's not after us. Even if objectively the same thing is happening, that you're losing your house, you're getting foreclosed on, subjectively, people were willing to blame George W. Bush in a way that they were not willing to blame Barack Obama. And since then have been willing to blame Trump in a way that they were not willing to blame Joe Biden. So I think that's one way in which we can say that it's not true, is that we can see that it's more difficult to get people to come out when they can't properly identify who is contributing to this problem. So that's a major issue. And I think that's a big one, which demonstrates the exact opposite of that premise or that theory. The other one is that it's easier. The other side of that is that once they're in office, it's easier to put pressure on the Democratic Party, for example, or someone who's a Democrat that you voted for, and therefore they owe you something. And so then you can put pressure on them to do things like, lower the interest rate, increase the amount of money going to Head Start programs, or increase the amount of money that is going to social welfare programs. Just to be perfectly clear and explicit, the left, liberals, certainly, and even centrists who are on the Democratic Party side were unable to convince the Biden administration in general and Kamala Harris in particular to stop funding and coordinating a genocide. Mm. So what do we, like, if you can't convince them to not engage in what do you think you're convincing them to do? What is it exactly that you're putting pressure on them to do? To give more money to pre-K programs, to after-school programs? What is it that you're doing if you're not able to get them to stop doing it? Like, how much bigger of a test do you want, or even smaller of a test? The bar is pretty low. The worst thing you can do in terms of human rights violations, in terms of international law, is a genocide. And I've heard people making excuses saying, well, Trump gets in office, he'll do worse. Tell me what is worse than a genocide. Maybe he'll do it a little more quickly. Maybe. We don't even know. I'm not sure he's competent enough to do it quickly. But the reality is the people who voted for Biden were unable to convince Biden that he should not fund a genocide. Not only not fund one, cut back the funding. Cut the funding in half for it. Only fund half the genocide. Don't give all the weapons to the genocide. Force them to get weapons from somewhere else. None of that happened. They actually increased every single time without even a close vote because they fully support the genocide, and you were not able to convince them otherwise. It simply is not true. The thing that allows you to put pressure over politicians is having power over them, not voting for them, and not currying favor with them.
Oof. Yeah, that's, very well said. Going back to your point about how people not blaming Obama or the Democrats for a lot of the bullshit that went on, especially during those crises, this housing crisis. I also feel like the Democrats know that and they run with that.
Absolutely.
And they perpetuate that propaganda.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think a part of that, the other place where we see that too, is with with immigration and the deportation of immigrants and the denial of asylum seekers into the U.S. Of course, Trump gets a lot of attention for that and a lot of blame for that. but Obama deported more people than Trump did.
Yeah, they
Obama
called
was
him
better at it.
the
He was more
deporter in
efficient.
chief, right?
Deporter in chief is his nickname, at least in some circles. So I'm not saying that Obama reveled in deportations in the same way Trump did. There are several differences in the way that they executed their plans, but Obama was much more efficient and effective at the execution of mass deportations than Trump was. Without this is not even like a question. And yet, progressive forces, so-called progressive forces, left forces, well, I always say that's not true about left forces absolutely blame it, but progressive forces and liberal forces do not blame Obama, and it's more difficult to organize. Now we're going to have a lot of organizing coming up in the next 4 years as Trump enters office around immigration. That did not happen under Biden and Harris. One of Harris's last trips during the campaign was, of course, to the border to commit to finishing Trump's wall and to deport more people. And there was no major outcry there. The outcry, even to the extent that existed, was a whimper. And I think it was shown in the voting results where Harris lost almost 10 million votes from the previous election. But it is more difficult to organize around those conditions when Democrats are in office than it is when Republicans are in office.
Yeah, and I think I don't want to veer off too much here, but I guess interested in what you think about, like you said, people don't blame Obama for the housing crisis, or I mean, I guess you could say some of that, or Iraq and Afghanistan. He was not in office at the beginning of those things, even if he continued them or even scaled some of those things up. And then in terms of the housing crisis and economic crash, bailed out banks and such. Uh, but on the right, and people can read this differently. They did put a lot of that on him, particularly the economic side of it. Now, obviously, that's intertwined with their own kind of ethno nationalism and white supremacy and all of that. So it's not perfect or some kind of righteous rage, but they did put that blame on him, even if it was to do even worse things, like you get the Tea Party movement and all that. And a lot of liberals just talk about those things. That's just simply a like white backlash response to a black man in office without any like material assessment of policies or the party or whatever. But under Obama, speaking of organizing, like they lost thousands or over 1,000 seats. Like when you go down to the local level, the state level, like the Democratic Party in general, actually, like it got worse in terms of just their amount of power within like state government. Because a lot of Obama being an organizer actually just collapsed a lot, or a former organizer supposedly collapsed a lot of the party structure around his campaigns, while a lot of down ballot races people were losing. So I'm curious what you think, I guess, about like how on the so-called left or the liberals or whatever, there's people who have a hard time placing blame on their folks. And Republicans do the same thing. That's why we're not trying to get into a Republican Democrat thing here. But how do we understand how some people are able to place the blame on, the Democrats, and it's the right. And I think because we're just told it's simply just racism, and I mean racism in a very like generic, abstract concept of it, right? Not a very material based. We don't even consider whatever those criticisms are. We don't really listen to
Yeah,
them. And then when they
it's
end up
very
in office,
interpersonal. You're right.
yeah, when they
Yeah.
end up in office, it's almost as people never really studied what the right believes. They've never really paid attention. So they have no real conception of those critiques. And again, I'm not here to uphold them. I'm just like, can we actually consider them? Like, how do you kind of contextualize the other side, being able to arrive at that conclusion, even if it's for reasons that we wouldn't agree with?
So what you're describing or articulating is exactly why we felt like we needed to write a position paper about the duopoly. The duopoly, of course, being a concentration of power among two entities, as opposed to a monopoly, which is concentration of power of one entity, or oligopoly among several entities. And in the political context, then the duopoly is the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And so what is happening here is that you have people who are on either side. This is the power of the duopoly here, is that on either side of the Democratic Party, with identifying with the Democratic Party or with the Republican Party, people are unable to criticize their own side, but they can criticize the other side. So Democrats can criticize Trump for deportations, mass deportations, but they can't criticize Obama for doing more mass deportations than Trump. Republicans, on the other hand, are unable to criticize George W. Bush for collapsing the economy, but they're able to criticize Barack Obama for collapsing the economy or responding in a way that he did, even though it was a bipartisan response. This is the power and really the insidious way in which the duopoly works. Then it creates these blind spots for these other sides, or at least gives you the opportunity to do that. And I think folks are giving each other messages. So on the right, on the Republican side, they are encouraging their membership, their people, their base to say to these racist conclusions, to the extent they are to these race-based conclusions, to say, blame Barack Obama for this because of some kind of evil thing that's going on because he's Black. And on the Democratic side, they're doing the same thing. They're saying to their base, look, these people are full of hate on the right, and you have to oppose them because Donald Trump hates immigrants. And he's doing these deportations because he hates immigrants. Even though he's not doing as many as Barack Obama did, Barack Obama doesn't hate immigrants. And that's what you then ultimately are against. So the duopoly that allows you to play these different sides. And as mentioned earlier, when I talked to folks and said, look, when people said to me, you should vote for Harris, like, I cannot vote for a genocider. And they said, well, Trump would do worse. And I'm like, well, what is worse than a genocide? This is the duopoly playing in people's minds. They want to defend their side. They want to defend their team. And I guess that's okay if it's a basketball team or football team, but it's not really, it doesn't make any sense when it's a political team. And certainly when it's a political team that isn't doing any favors.
Yeah, you just end up bouncing back and forth, and nobody really is held accountable for anything, honestly.
It means you're out. You don't really have any principles. And again, that's okay if your favorite sports team is your local sports team. It's okay if you don't have any principles and you say, that other team's terrible because they lost 5 games, and then your team lost 5 games and you still love them. So yeah, who cares about that? But when you're talking about actual politics, when you're talking about actual mass murder, when you're talking about denying people food and housing and healthcare and things like that, then that's a whole entirely different set of things that we're concerned about. I think this is the power, the power in the negative sense. This is the power of the duopoly, is that it allows safe spaces for folks to make harsh accusations on one side, but not apply those harsh accusations to the others. And in some cases, of course, it is strictly driven by racial animosity. In other instances, it's driven by being told that the other side hates you. And other times it's just money. It's just that's the team that you're on, and that's where you're getting funding from.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in itself, to look at these political parties as teams, or look at politics as my particular team, is so, for me, I feel like it's reductionist. It's like you're dealing with politics, like you said so eloquently, like these are people's lives you're dealing with. This is not a game, and it shouldn't be treated that way. But yet I feel as though in America it's the spectacle of politics, right? This really gets people going. Not to go on a tangent too much, but you see that, you kind of saw that with the Democrats. You saw that with them getting all these celebrities, getting certain rappers on stage, and it becomes a spectacle. It becomes a game, just like sports here in this country. You talked about primary contradictions. You said that the primary contradictions that we must confront are rooted in imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Of which Trumpism, like isms of Biden, Harris, and Obama, is merely a particular expression. And I like that saying is an expression. It's like a spectrum of things that already exist. But to start off, what is a primary contradiction?
So a primary contradiction is kind of like the core thing that you're dealing with or working with. And so we talk about primary contradictions in another context. When we're doing like workshops on this kind of thing, we talk about root causes versus surface manifestations. So, for example, if you have a runny nose, right? You have a runny nose, and like you're at a fancy dinner party or something like that, and your nose is running and you're dripping all over your nice outfit or on the food, then you got to wipe your nose because that's the manifestation, that's the expression of something happening. But if you think that the actual problem, I'm not saying it's not problematic, but if you think that the actual problem is that your nose is running, you could, in theory anyway, spend the rest of your life rubbing your nose, dabbing your nose, walking around with a napkin because your nose keeps running. Because your nose running is not the actual problem. That's not the core issue. That's not the primary contradiction, as it were. It's just an expression or manifestation of it. The real problem is that you're sick, is that you have something inside of you that is making you sick, and the expression of that. And at some point, even though you have to wipe your nose at the dinner table, on the fancy thing, you have to do that. At some point, you have to deal with the fact that you're sick. So in the same way, we have lack of housing, lack of health care, lack of education, and inadequate number of jobs, as well as lack of jobs. Those are the way that we feel it. Those are the way that we look at it. Those are the things that we have to deal with. You have to deal with on a monthly basis your landlord. You have to deal with on a monthly basis paying your electric bills, sending the kids to school, things like that. Those are the manifestations. But the reason why there's all these lacking is not because your landlord is a jerk. I'm not saying your landlord's not a jerk. Not because the doctors doesn't want to see you, or that the receptionist is mean at the clinic or at the hospital. It's because of capitalism. It's because there's economic incentives for the hospital or the clinic not to see you. There's economic incentives for the landlord to not fix your leaky toilet. There's economic incentives for all kinds of things. And so we can deal with what's on the surface. My landlord's a jerk. The person at the front desk at this place that I'm trying to buy some services from is a jerk. All these other things. You can try to deal with those by yelling at the person in front of you, but at some point you have to come to grips with the fact that the deeper problem is capitalism. And until we solve the problem of capitalism, profit driving the delivery of critical human needs, education, healthcare, food, housing, things like that, then we're going to continue to have these problems in different forms, because the housing crisis could look different in the United States than it does in other countries. It could look different in the United States today than it did 30 years ago, and that it will in 30 more years, assuming that capitalism is still around it. So we need to distinguish properly between when we're dealing with a surface issue, like when your nose is running, or a root cause or root issue. And the primary contradictions are those root issues. The real problems that we're seeing over and over again are a consequence of capitalism, are a consequence of white supremacy, and are a consequence of patriarchy. And they could look different from time to time, but they still behave in the same way. If I can just give one more example. In the 1940s, certainly before that, but 1940s and 50s, the law, and certainly throughout the South, but even the informal practice in other places inside of the United States, was that Black people were not allowed to live in certain neighborhoods. Like there were laws saying, this is where you can live and this is where you can't. So we could only live in this area, in this blocked off area that is east of this street and south of that street, etc. And these were called segregation laws. The segregation laws clearly delineated where we could go, where we could not go. We built an entire movement to end segregation. And some people anyway, thought that the segregation laws was the real problem. And then if you ended the segregation laws, the water will be cleaner, the air will be fresher, and everything will be great. But then we ended those segregation laws, and what happens today? Today, white people are coming into our neighborhoods and say, okay, this area that we box you into, it's kind of prime real estate right now, so you get out. And so they're taking us and they're moving us out of our neighborhoods, forcing us out by overactive police, by raising rents and taxes on property, by allowing conditions to dilapidate, by removing subsidies. All these things that they're little tricks that they're doing to get us out of our neighborhoods are working, and we're being forced out. And that today we call gentrification. So in the 1940s and 50s, it was segregation that said you have to live here and can't live anywhere else. In the 2000s, gentrification was saying, okay, I don't care where you live, but it's not going to be there because we want to live there now, and you got to move. This is a different manifestation of the same problem. Fundamentally, the problem is the same, is that we have no control over the land upon which we live, eat, play, go to school, go to work. Someone else has control over it, and therefore they can tell us you have to move here, or conversely, you have to move out of here. We say that segregation and gentrification are two sides of the exact same coin. And you can't solve segregation by fighting segregation laws, and you can't solve gentrification by fighting gentrification practices. You can only solve those by dealing with the root issue or the core contradictions that are inherent in land relationships in capitalism, is that the owner of a land, whoever has enough money to buy the land, makes full decisions over who gets to use it. That's the core contradiction. It's not segregation. It's not, even though that's something we have to look at and deal with, and that's the level in which most people relate to it. We have to understand it on a deeper level as social scientists so that we can solve this problem once and for all. Until we solve the problem of land relationships that exist the way they do under capitalism, we're constantly going to be going through cycles of gentrification, segregation, and any other way that could manifest in the future.
Yeah, that's no, I appreciate that breakdown.
Definitely.
And I think about also I guess thinking about the duopoly, the way that the duopoly traps the organizing in and of itself into those kind of binaries, right? So the Democrats will say they're the party of the civil rights movement or something, and they're going to fight housing based on the legacy of that. So we beat segregation, so now we're going to give people tax credits so they can stay in their homes or something and build black wealth or whatever, so they don't get kicked out. And then the Republicans come with either no idea on that at all, or just or just like some kind of, souped up version of the same kind of neoliberal thing where it's like, well, we're going to create opportunity zones, which actually started under Clinton, I believe, but we're going to create opportunity zones in black neighborhoods or something like that. And that's going to be the way we address housing. And then since those two parties have the main marketing force to get those messages out, that becomes the way that we, I guess, kind of break down. Like, that's how our politics break down. So you talk about the duopoly as an economic term, primarily first in the piece before you get to the political aspect of it. So how does a duopoly as a kind of economic term relate to how we understand U.S. politics in terms of kind of what I just said and what you laid out in terms of how it in a way kind of just ends it almost it keeps you away from the primary contradictions, right?
Yeah, I think one of the things again that it does so brilliantly, as we talked about earlier, is that it gives places for people to go in what looks like two different poles. They're not actually two different poles, but what looks like a range of expression, so that they can say to Black audiences, here's where you go if you are upset about housing. We'll throw in some Section 8 vouchers, and that will be our concession, even though the overall trend towards reducing housing. And then the Republicans say, we're not doing Section 8, but neither Section 8 or no Section 8 is solving the actual problem. They're still demolishing public housing. There's still not enough out of it. It's still market-based housing. But then people feel better because at least the Democrats are saying, okay, we're going to give you Section 8. This is also how they keep us from rising up. So you can imagine if there was no Section 8, people would be up protesting and worse all the time. And so that's a way, it's in a real sense, in a real practical way, is a systems counterinsurgency. Because then it allows them to let off steam and make us feel like we're spending all kinds of energy to get a basic reform that doesn't even solve the problem. But we feel like it's doing something, and so therefore we continue to go back to it. So we have to understand these at a much deeper level. In terms of the economic, so of course, economic sense of the term itself, duopoly, started as an economic term in order to describe a variant or a different version of a monopoly. So monopoly, of course, is when one company or one entity controls a market or controls things in a purview. And of course, monopolies are frowned upon by even capitalist societies, even though that's ultimately where they would lead as monopolies. But duopolies are legal. Now, it's not that it's the best situation even under capitalism, but duopolies are legal because it's not a monopoly. Monopoly is a very particular thing where only one company runs everything. So if you think about other duopolies and how they work, A couple of examples that we talk about in the paper is Coke and Pepsi. So Coke and Pepsi control something like 70% of the soda market. And that doesn't mean just Coke and Pepsi. That means Sprite and 7-Up, which are owned by Coke and Pepsi, and all these different other ones are both owned by the
Mountain Dew,
Mountain Dew, and
yeah,
what is it, Mist, whatever it is. They have similar ones, Diet Coke, Coke, and Diet Coke. So they have similar versions all the way. So wherever you're going to one member of the duopoly or the other. And it was, of course, found. But if you go outside of the U.S., you can see it even more clearly. There are countries, certainly in South and Central America and throughout the Caribbean, that essentially only sell one of them. They either sell Coke or they sell Pepsi. They don't sell both. And the reason is because Coke and Pepsi have meetings, even though this will be competitors, and they say, okay, we're not going to fight about this. Let's split this up. You get these countries, we get these countries, and this is what the exchange ends up looking like. So it really means that you don't have that many choices. Or when there are choices, when there's another soda that comes out, it's hard to find because you can't find it in the supermarket. The supermarket has limited amount of space, and they're going to go with the big companies. So you'd have to go out of your way to find it in a little bodega, and then of course it costs a lot more there. So you have to pay more money for a smaller range soda that's harder to find. So these are all problems. The duopoly ended up taking up all our economic time and space, and then all of our political time and space on the political side. So the idea though of a duopoly, and then the other duopoly we talk about in the paper is in the computer operating system space, where you have Windows as one way of running your computer and the Apple operating system, Apple OS or Mac OS on the other. And the two are supposed to be competitors. But when Apple was about to go out of business in the 1990s, they got bailed out, they got rescued by Windows, by Microsoft. Microsoft gave them $150 million. Do you know why? Because they were under investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice for monopoly practices. If Apple would have gone under, Microsoft would have been broken up into multiple companies, broken up because it was a monopoly. Microsoft had to have Apple in business in order for them to stay in business. Right? In the same way, yeah, absolutely. In the same way, the Democratic Party needs the Republican Party to stay in business. There's no way Barack Obama could have deported all those people and not have a mass movement against them unless he could have turned and said, do you want to go back to George W. Bush? Do you want to go back to Donald Trump? And the same thing, Trump was able to go in and say, do you want to go back to some Kenyan-born socialists to run things, or do you want to? So the two sides have an interest in the other. They cooperate with each other. They work with each other. If one of them goes out of business, it is a major problem for the other. Yeah, so they have to work together.
You're right. They're in collusion with one another.
Yes.
That's one thing that jumped up to me about that piece. How you explain duopoly with the soda companies and then the tech companies, and then how they buy up all the third party, brands, especially with soda, right? With Coca-Cola and Pepsi, 7-Up is owned by Pepsi, Sprite is owned by Coca-Cola, so on and so forth. But also, I like the fact in your piece how you compare that with politics as well, with third parties, and how each of the duopoly kind of consumes the third parties, or they push them out to make it harder to for the regular people to even know they exist or even the work that they do. I was wondering, could you possibly go into more detail with that portion of your piece?
So yeah, on the political side, of course, there's a lot of third parties. It's not actually a shortage of it. There's the Working Families Party, and there's a few other parties, and of course, there used to be the Tea Party. Tea Party completely got swallowed into the Democratic Party, but these other parties, or even these 501c4 organizations that are allowed to engage in some kind of political work, they're really doing a bunch of work that's directed towards the Democratic Party. So some of these third parties, they are supposedly run people for office, but they roll their primary process into the Democratic Party primary process. So the winner of their primary process, many of these third parties don't even know that this party exists. They just run it. They're running whoever's running. Joe Biden, could be the nominee for whatever random political party, because they're just a way of corralling. They can't compete by themselves. They basically corral a bunch of votes into the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party then provides them with some funding.
The workers Working Families Party, that they do fusion ballots, and they'll run a line as a quote unquote independent party, but
Yes.
they'll have, you know, Joe Biden on the ticket
Yep.
or AOC on
Okay,
the
I was about to
ticket,
say
or
that. Aren't they
yeah,
like a
yeah,
pipeline to the Democratic Party
They are.
yeah,
in a
So
way?
it's
yeah.
a party that's actually a left version of the Democratic Party. But instead of
Mm.
becoming their own party, they're just funneling people into the Democratic Party. It just becomes just like you have some of these smaller soda companies that they're independent. They start out as a black owned or a Latina owned soda company, and then it's bought out and then it's absorbed into the duopoly, into one of the sides of the duopoly.
I mean, I think you speak to a deeper logic within capitalism in terms of, and more broadly imperialism, but in terms of just like I remember there was a time in my life where I worked somewhat with tech people, and the goal was literally to build up a company and get bought. That
To
was the
be
point.
acquired. Exactly
Yeah.
right. Because you know you can't
My
beat them in the long
goodness.
run.
I
Yeah.
forgot about that.
Yeah,
You're right.
the
I remember
point
those days.
the point was never to, you wanted to get as big as you could, so when you went to the bargaining table, but the point was always to get to the table with whatever the big company was in that market. So if you wanted to make a certain kind of application that Google might find interesting, you ultimately wanted Google to buy your shit. It wasn't nobody wanted to compete with Google. Like, I mean, this is just regular within the tech world. Like, you are looking to get bought, and the logic of those companies is, even if this doesn't make us money, we're still gonna buy it because, it makes us money in the long run because we don't have to deal with the competition. It does,
You don't have to
and
deal
the
with the
market
competition.
is, yeah, the market is still stabilized because I don't have to deal with anyone else. So there's
Yep.
this deeper logic, I think, now where people, even when I don't want to veer off too much here, but I'm saying even when folks talk about black business or whatever, it's a charade for many reasons, in terms of it can't even really compete. But also, I think if you go back to a different era, there were black folks who, even if it didn't work, they were trying to create their own kind of parallel business to the industry that existed that black folks could own. I think more and more now you see folks doing like deals with corporations, and they just get like a budget within it to do like a black thing, or they build up a business that eventually can get bought out by. But I'm saying more, I don't, when we think about capitalism, that the logic didn't used to be you wanted to get bought out. People did used to want to try to compete in a different era, but in this era, more and more when you talk to folks, they want to to get the fusion of capital
Well,
from the
you
yeah.
know, this is going to come to no surprises those who, look at dialectics and this thing, but this is exactly what in the 1800s Karl Marx predicted. He said that
Yeah.
capital, because of the way that it works, will consolidate, and that the bigger fish will consume the smaller fish and
Yeah.
get even bigger itself, and that will make it more difficult for the smaller fish to come in. So even though they say that they want a free trade and that they want this competition, if capitalism is left sufficiently unchecked, not even completely unchecked, completely checked, that happens very quickly, but sufficiently unchecked, then it will result in consolidation. Like what's happening now with all this consolidation is exactly what Marx said would happen
Yeah.
in the 1800s, because it's the natural outcome of it.
It's an
And this
inevitable.
shift,
Yeah.
in the same
Yeah.
way, the shift to the right of the two parties in the duopoly, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, is exactly what happens when you have a duopoly inside of a capitalist state. Is they will both shift to the right because it's the only
Hmm.
direction for them to shift to, and the only thing that can shift them over to the left. The only thing that can keep monopolies from forming in capitalism is heavy regulation or the destruction of capitalism. But in this, the only thing that can keep the parties from just going endlessly to the right is a social movement that forces them to say, okay, this is not working anymore right now. We have to go back and pay attention to them. We have to create this release valve. We have to shift to the left temporarily in order to adjust them. That's exactly what happened as a consequence of the civil rights and the Black Power movement, is that the Democratic Party was the one given the job of appealing to those who were engaged in those kinds of protests, and then trying to get them to move a little bit to the right, and then further
And I
and further to
think
the right.
I think similar to that point and what we were saying in terms of the consolidation effect that happens under capitalism in terms of even the politics. social movements used to emerge, whether they were successful or not. They used to emerge with an idea of being independent. More and more, when social movements emerge today, that the goal is similar to what we're talking about with business. The goal is not really to be independent. The goal is to just be kind of a lobbyist group
Is to get
within one of the
funding from the
parties.
Democratic Party.
Yeah,
Yes.
like
Yeah.
you are selling yourself because again, it's
Right.
just this is
But I would
consistent
say
across a lot of
this is a
industries.
full
Yeah.
recognition of the market. This is
Hmm.
actual logical thinking because even though it was possible to be independent in the 50s and 60s, today it's not viable, at least
Hmm.
to reach certain scale, without doing that, without going in that direction.
hmm Yeah, and
Yeah,
even in
It's just not
the
possible.
nonprofit world, nonprofit industrial complex, you depend on like funding from both sides. There's no way that you can actually get any kind of like radical work done. You just have to make concessions. And also, I was thinking about what you said earlier. It makes sense that because we live in a capitalist system, that both parties will continue to move to the right because if moving to the left will ultimately cause the demise of the system that they benefit from. So, yeah.
Yeah, the left
Yeah.
just becomes a way of maybe if you read like conflict theory and like in sociology,
hmm
they the sometimes conflict theory becomes accepted as this the people who are like the status quo as a name, there's a term for it in social in sociology, I can't remember, but the people who are the status quo will sometimes take from conflict theory or the conflict perspective as they call it, which if you read in some of these bad sociology books they'll say like has some Marxist perspective to it, but they'll take from it as like a correction. So you see some of this now, like okay, the Democrats lost, and they're like, well, maybe Bernie Sanders was right or something. Not because they really want to do that or anything further left than that. It's just like an acknowledgement that there's an instability here if we go too far. They're seeing some sectors speak that I don't know where it will go, but some sectors within the Democrats and the progressive wing of it is like, and even some of the centrists, like maybe Bernie Sanders was right, and that we need to deal with some version. We need to do something for working people. Like we need to give them some crumbs. We can't just totally act like they don't exist, right? So that becomes it becomes a thing, but more so just as a corrective to keep the status quo going. Like sometimes it'll take the critiques as a way of being like, okay, we could loosen up here to keep stability of the system. Others are just like, we're just gonna go full out. We're gonna bulldoze
Yeah.
everything,
Yeah,
you
I
know.
do
And
think that
then,
this is a tension happening right now in the ruling class about how far to the
Hmm.
right they can possibly go and still hold things together.
Right.
But I think we're at the point now where we're gonna start seeing splits in parties. And certainly it seems with Trump back in office and some of the things that he seems like he wants to accomplish, this could be the point where they've gone so far to the right that they will go full out fascism. And of course, fascism is a one-party system. So they would go, and this is natural. This is gonna when you start out with the duopoly in a capital, it will eventually lead to a one-party fascist state. So I think that's where it's ultimately going to go. I don't know if it's going to go there now, but I think that's the logical conclusion.
Yeah, it's a logical
yeah.
conclusion, or it becomes the like again, like you said, it becomes that split. That's the tension, and that tension has happened before. You know that was the tension with Roosevelt, um, and that could have went a different way at the same time. You
Absolutely.
know, that could have went the other way in terms of further left than that as well. You know, people kind of forget that.
Yes,
Um,
but it's interesting that Roosevelt and the Democrats played a significant role in crushing the Socialist Party,
yep.
that who was making significant electoral gains right before then, and they never made those kind of gains again.
No, no. And then Truman comes in and it's just like we're wiping out everybody. So, full Red Scare. I guess we've talked kind of about just how this all plays out, but the move to the I guess we're calling it dissident energy for lack of a better term, but you say in the piece, the first observation of note is that just because Dems are losing does not mean that we are winning. It is not a foregone conclusion that those disillusioned by the Democrats will necessarily move firmly to the left. and into liberatory organizing structures. So we're talking about how there's these fissures and these breakdowns, and that could mean a good thing, but it's not inherently a good thing. And we know a lot of people don't trust the so-called system anymore. A lot of people are tired of that, but just for folks who sometimes read that as a inherently positive thing, why doesn't dissatisfaction inherently lead to revolution in the way that we would see it, like in a obviously not some kind of counter revolution, but why doesn't dissatisfaction, rage inherently just lead to that outcome, which sometimes I think people on the left get confused about.
Yeah, I think that the people on the left have a tendency to want everyone else around them to be inherently good or inherently kind, or see things the way that the rest of us do. But in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire said that when you have oppressed people who see that they are oppressed and they can recognize who the oppressor is. Once they recognize that there's an oppressor and oppressed, that they see that it's two different poles, an oppressor on the top and oppressor. But the initial tendency of the oppressed is not to end oppression, it's to switch the poles, is for them to become the oppressor and for the oppressed to become for the oppressor to become the oppressed. Or even for them to become the oppressor and someone else become oppressed. And this is why we see in a lot of family dynamics, you have, for example, a man who's out working and taking all kinds of abuse over at the job and feels dehumanized at the job. So what does he do? He comes home and he exercises his authority at home, and he brutalizes his wife, he brutalizes his children, and gives him some sense of feeling like he is in control. He doesn't say, I have suffered this injustice at work, so therefore I'm going to have no injustice in my house. He says, I suffered this injustice at work, and therefore I'm at home, I'm going to be the boss, and I'm going to behave like the boss. At home, I'm going to behave like the boss behaves at work. So I think there is this, and I think Pierre is right. And Pierre says the only way out of that dynamic is through political education, is through theory, identifying that this is oppression and this is oppression, there's oppressed and oppressors, and we need to not switch the poles, but we need to end the poles altogether. We need to end oppression. That's what we're trying to do. But that's not a natural position for people to take when you're raised and you see these poles and you see that this is the way society works. The natural position for people to take is, because that's what you learn, is that I must become the oppressor. So we have to then reteach this part. So Harris became the vice president with all these votes because people came out to vote out of fear of Trump, and they got a record number of votes, 81 million, somewhere in that neighborhood, that Biden and Harris did in 2020. But then in 2024, they lost almost 10 million votes. They lost 7 million votes between 2020 and 2024. But they're running against the same Trump. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Because a bunch of people who were willing to vote for her one time when she was criticizing the Trump's border policies, did not vote for her after she then turned around right after the election and said, we're going to do the same thing. Do not bother coming. Don't come. And then
nobody was ever willing to vote for her in 2020 either, but
either way, her team,
yeah.
I know, group, whatever. Yeah. So and then of course people don't want to vote for a genocider. So the people are fleeing the Democratic Party because right now they're just standing for nothing. They're just a weak Republican Party, and if that's what you want to vote for, then just vote for the Republican Party. Like, what do you know? Why would I vote for that? So I think so just because people are leaving the Democratic Party, which they are, just because people are leaving the Democratic Party doesn't mean they're coming to us. Some are disengaging altogether. Some are going to the organizations, to the political parties that are to the left of the Democratic Party, but are feeding you back into the Democratic Party. Some are going to the Republican Party. We're hearing reports about how there are some disaffected among us and among Black people who are voting for Republicans because for whatever reason. There's a whole range of reasons why. So that just because they're leaving the Democrat doesn't mean they're coming to us. We actually need to engage in political education. We need to say there is another vision of the world that we have, And we can bring that vision to reality. And then people have to believe that we are able to do that, which is why organizational infrastructure, organizational systems and processes are so important to me, because we have to demonstrate to people that we are not just these folks on the corner who are yelling and saying, things would be different if we were in power, but then when we get in power, we don't know how to keep the cars running and getting bread to the store and getting delivering mail. Right, we're going to have to be able to do that, and to do that, we need to have infrastructure, we need to have systems, we need to have professionalism. I don't mean professionalism in the capitalist sense, but I mean professionalism in that we need to have people in positions who know what they're doing and are doing those things. So until we get those things in place, people would not necessarily leave the Democratic Party and come to us. In fact, we say that you can't convince people to leave the Democratic Party. The only thing you can do is you can convince people to come to you. They'll come into our organizations, but they'll do that. They'll leave the Democratic Party, not in some leaving the Democratic Party sense. They'll leave it just because they're coming to another place. And we need to provide that other place. But in order to provide that other place, we have to provide a good vision. And then we have to convince people that that vision is not some pie in the sky thing that we're just making up. And we have to then be able to demonstrate that we can put that vision into practice. We can put that vision into effect. That's the only way we're going to win folks over to revolution. That's the only way we're going to win folks over to our side, to our organizations, to our movement. And we need to do that. And there's no better time to do that now, because people are disenchanted with the duopoly, are disenchanted with capitalism, with white supremacy, with patriarchy. They just don't know where to go as a result. So now we need to step up our game so we can say, this is a legitimate place to go. Your life will actually be better if you join this movement.
No, that's real. Listen to you talk. Yeah, it makes sense why the dissatisfaction with the Democratic Party won't lead to just people becoming just proper leftists and radicals. I have a friend who experienced that same thing. They're dissatisfied with the Democratic Party, but they end up joining, I think, what's called the Working Families Party, which is just another pipeline into the Democratic Party. She literally told that to me in a conversation, and I remember telling her this, but she joined anyway. So you're right. We have to have a structure set in place on our side that can speak to the people's material needs, that, like you say, have vision, have theory, and be able to address a lot of these things that people, are dissatisfied when it comes to the Democratic Party. And, I was wondering, what are some positive and or negative historical examples of dissatisfaction among the masses, and where they can go as far as, when it comes to the duopoly in the Democratic Party and Republican Party? Are there any historical examples of that?
Well, I think the two biggest that we've seen was, of course, in the early 1900s, 19-teens, when there was a significant creep up in the number of lynchings that happened in the country. Neither the Democratic Party nor the Republican Party were doing anything about it of note. And Black people had to figure out, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to solve this problem ourselves? And as a result, the largest Black organization in the history of the planet still developed, and that was Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. People joined that in droves because they knew that they weren't going to be able to end lynchings with the Democratic Party, and they knew they weren't going to be able to end lynchings with the Republican Party. And they thought maybe there's a chance that we can end lynchings if we all band together and we form our own organization, we form our own party. So I think that is one where there are millions of disaffected people who then join organizations that are still impacting the way we think about organization and we think about independent political power to this day. And that happened in the 19-teens, right? So I think that was one major moment when that happened. I think the second major moment that happened was in the 50s and 60s with the civil rights movement, and then immediately followed, as there became disaffection with the civil rights movement as it got drawn further into the Democratic Party, with then the Black Power movement. So we had a large number of people, and to be fair, certainly when it started out with a bunch of Black middle class folks, and that's why it was so able to be captured so easily by the Democratic Party, who were wanted to end the legal segregation. But then at some point, people said, look, this ending segregation just ain't cutting it. So now I'm allowed to go into the restaurant downtown, but I still don't have any money. So even though they can't keep me out because of my race, I can't eat there because I ain't got no money. And so we need to do something a little more radical than saying, let's open up the door to any Black people who actually have money. And we need to get more Black people money. And that was what opened up space for the Black Power movement. But millions of people left the Democratic Party and joined the Black Panther Party and volunteered their time. And they got free breakfast from there. They got free groceries from there. They went there for their health clinics. And they stuck by them even as they recognized that the state was murdering the leaders of the Black Panther Party. Of course, when it accelerated to a certain point, it caused the collapse of the Black Panther Party and the Black Power movement in general, because they militarily defeated us. But that was certainly a time when there was large numbers of people who were turned off by the duopoly and who felt like the duopoly were not providing them with any solutions. And they saw this firsthand, many people did, with the way the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party tried to take hold and went to the Democratic Party convention, and the Democratic Party convention kept them out, even though they committed fully to the Democratic Party. And instead they kept in white people who said, if this doesn't turn out the way we want, we're going to leave. But the Democratic Party still stuck with the white people who said they would not commit to the Democratic Party, instead of sticking with the Black people who said they would. Like, you didn't have to do anything more to convince those people. They were done with the Democratic Party. And then that's what then really set things in motion for the Black Panther Party to come, and other radical movements as well. I think those are two major times when it happened. I think we also, in some kind of way, we skipped a period here. We've had lots of movements since the early 2000s. Certainly around Trayvon Martin, certainly around George Floyd, certainly around all those Breonna Taylor, all these police murders and shootings. But it's not taken root and built up a large radical Black movement. And I think it's because of the 501c3 industrial complex that we haven't been able to do. Too many of our forces are stuck in that area. I'm not saying that none of us should be there. We certainly should have had relationships and have been in them, but as a movement, we need to be more diversified than having all of our forces in the 501c3. But I think those are two historic examples in the 19-teens and in the 1950s and 60s, where people were fed up with the duopoly and they moved to something else in large numbers. And the system was forced to make significant changes as a result, because the option for them was to either give us something. They weren't going to give us what we asked for, just to be clear, but to give us some version of it, or to risk the chance of losing it all.
Right. Yeah, I think that thanks for those historical examples. And I think that even speaks to what we were talking about earlier, just in terms of the goal with those formations, whether they failed or succeeded, was to build something independent. Like, they weren't bluffing.
No, definitely not.
Yes, exactly right.
At best, people are bluffing today, and that's at best. Many times they don't even propose, So there's
Can I just say on that point, I think that's an extremely critical point. When we try earnestly to make some kind of change, like get more housing or get children breakfast in school, we can't win that. But when we say, you know what, we don't need you to give a breakfast in school. Not only that, we don't want you to feed our children anything because we don't trust you. We're going to do it ourselves. Then suddenly the entire country got free breakfast for children.
Mm.
Like, even you would think that they would catch on to that, saying, okay, the way to get it is to not bluff and to actually do it ourselves, because they don't want that, because the state does not want to be irrelevant in our lives. But
Right.
as soon as we say, we don't need you, we're going back to Africa, or we don't need you, we're going to feed our own children and open up our own schools, then suddenly they got all kinds of money to give to a Great Society program,
Right.
free breakfast,
Right.
things like that, right? But you
Yeah.
can't be bluffing. You have to actually mean it.
Right.
Yeah. It has to be a serious, and because that's the point. The point isn't, like, I was doing an interview about my book with, I won't say the who I was talking with, but they were almost saying maybe the point is to get co-opted in a way. Like, that was, or the point is to do things to force a concession. And I'm like, the point, I was like, that might be how it ends, because you just don't have the power to do anything else. But that's not the point.
That's not
Like,
the
you
point.
don't do it, because then even if that's how you move, it's not going to be real organizing, and that will show up in the work itself. The people that you're battling against will not take you as seriously. And that's what I'm saying. I feel like a lot of what's happened here recently comes off more as, ultimately, we want to be let in, hand wring about it, but ultimately we want to be let in. That is the pitch that we're making. We're not trying to go a different route. We're not even doing it, we're not even, like I said, we're really not even bluffing most of the time because we're not even like gassing it up like we might go there. But you see, even with little things where it's not even an organization, you just see like they read a poll and they're like, Black men may not vote for us. They do this every election, even if we vote for the Democrats. And when they get a little poll, then all of a sudden, Kamala releases some policies that she would probably never release just because a poll says that Black men may not vote for you like that.
Yeah.
A poll that didn't even really prove to be very accurate, but just, and it was chump change, it was crypto and whatever. But I'm just saying, like, they clearly are. There is a fear of losing, like you said, relevancy, the state losing relevancy in our lives. But so many of us have been conditioned, I think, within this market logic of really the goal is to just sell out. And I don't even mean that in a moral sense. Like quite literally, the goal is to sell out.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And then they kind of condition the people to accept the crumbs, right? The crumbs in
Yeah.
itself are going to be there's going to be propaganda built around the crumbs that make it seem like it's radical, right? But
Yes.
it is like, to your point about Kamala talking about her plan for Black men crypto and mentoring programs, is like, really? Like, I was like, come on, man. But yeah, that's all I had to say. That's it.
A question to kind of transition before we get to the dual power questions. We're talking about a lot of this, and we even in part one, we talk a lot about the federal level, the president, the big 4-year campaigns, because that's where you actually see people vote in a relatively decent share, like you get 60, 70%. But most campaigns are not the president, obviously, and most politicians are not on the federal level. They exist in like state and local governments. And we've done episodes on hyper local politics and how that's a flaw, like all politics being local and as if, everything is just about what you do on your block or something. Like that doesn't hold up when you're battling imperialism. But how does this concept of a political duopoly impact our statewide and local context? Because where one party might dominate, because like for instance, where we're here in Indiana, in the statewide it's Republicans and it's like a super majority. So whatever they want to pass, they can pass. Maybe this is why when a Republican gets elected, I'm not really as bothered by it because I'm from Indiana. You know what I'm saying? So so it's like I'm not saying I don't have any
Oh man,
concern, but I'm just saying like we already living under half of that anyway. So it's just like, all right, but
we've
I'm
been living in
saying,
hell.
but we were talking about earlier how they bounce off of each other, and I think that's true generally. But within the state of Indiana, the Republicans don't really need to bounce off the Democrats in the same way because they do truly hold power, and the only places the Democrats have power is like here in Indianapolis and like certain cities. But even the city often is getting bullied by the state legislator who can cut education budgets or cut this or that. So there's some obviously play off each other in that sense. Like you know, I live around, I live by near this hotel and I was walking through and they had a Indiana County Commissions conference and it's like all white folks, just all crackers. Like there's no county commissioners that are black at all. Like it's just all Republicans right within this conference. So they really run things around here. And again, this is not a getting on one side, but I guess just thinking about more down to the level where a lot of us live, which is in cities, obviously, state, whatever. How do we understand it then when it's not maybe as push and pull as it is like on a federal level?
Yeah, I do think that's absolutely correct. I also think that excuse me, in many instances, the local things that happen, they do try to push and pull it to the higher levels.
Right,
even
right.
though it's happening on a local level, and with some success and some not success. So I think the Democratic Party would say to Black people living in Indiana, is this what you want nationally, or this is happening bad? And it's the Republicans that are doing it. So therefore, on the national level, you should vote for or support Democrats. But even when they say that, as we identified through other instances, they don't actually mean it. So even when they're saying, Trump is going to do this stuff on the border, and then after they win, they announce that they're going to do the same thing Trump said he was going to do. They don't have to mean it; they just have to use it as part of this play back and forth. I think also the way so-called culture wars, are playing out. That's another area where they do it, particularly on the Republican side, but certainly not exclusively. Where the culture is saying, look, even though you may be happy or unhappy with what's going on here locally, if you're happy with it, then we're going to protect it by protecting people here from trans folks or whatever. Or they can use the same culture wars as a way of diverting attention from their own failures. So the school is falling apart. Well, we're going to make sure no trans folks are coming into the bathrooms. So I think that's a way in which they could, and then they tie that to the Democrat. One is a threat, but then they tie that to the Democratic Party, and that's why you have to continue to support us, because if you don't support us, then we're going to do this. The other place we've seen that happen, I think, really clearly in a bigger, not so much in the duopoly sense, but certainly in the capitalist versus socialist sense, is over the past couple of years, as we've had more storms, as we've had more extreme weather events because of global warming, because of climate change. In particular, I want to say it was in 2023, there were these storms that happened in Texas, and large swaths of the state were out of power. I think it was mainly around Houston, but millions of people lost power. And there was there's been no rebuilding of the power infrastructure here. There's been no investment in the power infrastructure. Maybe there should be, or maybe, maybe the utilities should be public utilities, not these private companies that are people starting to. So there was a massive push then on behalf of the Republicans who were in charge all throughout there to say, you don't want socialized utilities, then you're going to have widespread power outage. They were literally describing what was happening right then and there in Texas and saying, you do not want socialism because this could happen. And people believed it. People then were like, yeah, we don't want that. We don't want all that, even though they were living it at that exact time. So I think there is a certain amount, that's where the real benefit of having this boogeyman is there. And maybe they weren't able to play that directly on the Democrats. And I think the Democratic Party would have done the same thing had they been the ones in power.
No, you're right. It wasn't Houston because, I mean, a little bit of background. I work in student loans, and we had to give out disaster forbearances for people who lived in Houston, who experienced those floodings. But also, you're right. There's no investment in the power grid. There's no investment into trying to make. It's just relocating people, or even that. But there's nothing. There's no kind of revolutionary change, any kind of change to what's the issues that are down there. My father's an electrician. He said he's been saying this for decades since I was a kid. Our power grid has been outdated for some time now, and there's no kind of investment in making the situation better. But yeah, you're right. You're right. It just kind of keeps things in perpetual cycle of just disaster happens, throw little crumbs, nothing changes, keep
and
it
then
moving.
You have someone else to blame.
You have someone else to blame. Failures. You're right.
Yeah. And I see what you're saying in terms of they will play local stories off other local stories. So I'm so in the sense that if something's happening in Ohio next door to us, when like you were saying, I don't know, the Haitians coming to eating frogs or whatever the hell that shit was, right? The Trump story. So do you want the Haitians to come eat you in Indiana or whatever? They'll play off of that, even though that's Springfield, Ohio. We're not even in the same state. They'll play off of that. I guess I'm just thinking that locally, there's still the game that we're talking about. The duopoly game still takes place. I just think it's a little different locally because some places, depending on the minority party is just perpetual losers. So their only excuse is just like, we can't do anything because I guess we're always losing. Like here, the Democrats are perpetual losers, in a very literal way. I don't mean that again morally. I'm just that too. But I'm saying like they lose all the time, you know. So it almost becomes this sense of we can't do anything, but not even like the way the Democrats talk about it nationally, where it's like, well, the parliamentarian, or we don't have we only have a small majority, so we can only go so far. Like here, they're like, we just don't have any power at all. But then they become like this kind of faux resistance to the worst impulses of the Republicans. I think that's kind of how that plays out.
I think also it gives them the chance to make these really, moralistic statements because they have there's no time and space in which they would have to implement any of those moralistic statements. So, like now we see a lot of organizations who have been doing these land acknowledgements, saying, "Well, we're on this land, this indigenous land, or that indigenous land," but they stopped saying that after the Israeli genocide against Palestine began, because then it actually meant something. Because then if you're making land acknowledgements here, well, can you make this land acknowledgement, which they're not going to do? So they had to stop making those. So once rubber hits the road, then they can no longer say, now, as long as they're perpetual losers, they can say whatever they want. We take care of all of you. We believe in the expansion of healthcare. We believe in the expansion of housing. We believe, because they know they're not going to have to put into place. And just like, even when they are going to have a chance to put in place, like we saw with the criticism from Biden and Harris about the Trump immigration implementation of their immigration policy, when they got in office, they still didn't do it. They had a chance to do it. They did. So if you had no chance of getting in power, you can say whatever you want.
Right.
So I think that just provides them with the convenient, again, creating this boogeyman and a convenient way out where they never actually have to put their politics into play. What they say in their politics anyway.
Right. And then if you are in power, regardless of which party, you have no incentive to do anything beyond what your donors want you to do, because
and then you only have to do marginally better before you say, look, we're not as bad as this person. You don't want these people back in power, do you? Like you just have to do. So if there's a housing crisis, and there's 100,000 people on the housing wait list, and you're saying, look, we're going to do 5,000 Section 8 vouchers. And you're like, well, that's not going to solve the problem. Do you want to go back to Republicans? Is that what you want? Go ahead, complain. That's what you go back to. They're not giving any housing vouchers. And so we then take the 5,000, even though we know that's not solving the problem.
Right. And you'll get some, we're talking about the nonprofits for all the criticism. You'll get some nonprofits who in certain states, like up in Minnesota, some of the movement builders up there, have at least been able to get like free pre-K and some a little bit more social welfare, because they are embedded in that Democratic Party structure. They might be able to negotiate things here and there. Like you'll get stuff like that in different states. But generally speaking, and even that's not enough. But generally speaking, they don't feel threatened. Or in Illinois, I'm just talking about Midwest stuff that I know. But like in Illinois, because of Chicago, you'll get a few things here and there because they dominate the state. But they have a billionaire governor. You know what I mean? So, so that contradiction speaks pretty loudly. I guess to get to kind of, people always do this, what's the solution question or whatever. So to get to some of those questions, you talk about dual power. I'm gonna read two quotes here in this paper. So it says, but to win over the people, you really kind of said this, but I want to read the quote. But to win over the people, to win the people over the long haul, we must build organizational infrastructure and systems required to deliver quality of life improvements over time, required to demonstrate the capacity to take power and govern effectively. And you also say we must build dual power structures capable of competing with the duopoly for the political attention, engagement, and loyalty of our people. So for those who don't know, what is dual power? You go back in history as far as you need to. But what is dual power? It's a term people might see on the internet sometimes. But what is that? What's the goals of building dual power?
So dual power is a term coined by Vladimir Lenin when he was describing what was happening during the Russian Revolution in the aftermath of 1917 February Revolution. So they weren't fully in power yet, but there were things that were happening. So in 1917, there was a major uprising in Russia that had been building for a long, long time. And there were then certain provinces where the insurgent group, the Soviets, the rebel group, took power, and there were other places where they could not take power, and there were some places where it was teetering, where basically there was a city where the insurgents, the Soviets, had basically half the city, had like the east side, and then the provisional government had the west, like the regular. The government folks had the other side, the traditional government, the historic government folks had the west side. And so someone would be walking down the street in that city, and almost quite literally, would walk down the street, and on the left side of the street would be an insurgent grocery store, and on the right side of the street would be a provisional government grocery store, from the historic government. On the left side of the street would be a insurgent electric company, and on the right side of the street would be an electric company run by the provisional government. And on the left side of the street would be a post office from the insurgents, and on the right side of the street, the post office from the traditional government. So who there is the legitimate grocery store, the legitimate electric company, the legitimate post office? And what it ultimately came down to was who was able to deliver those things. When you went to the grocery store on either the left side or the street, was there bread and milk there? If there wasn't, that's the legitimate store. When you walk into the post office, does your mail get delivered on time? If so, that's the legitimate mailing place. And when you go to the electric company, is the electricity in your house coming on? And if so, that's the legitimate space. That is dual powers, where there's two different entities who are competing for power, not cooperating like a duopoly now, not where they're meeting behind the scenes and pretending to, but they're actually fighting for control, for state power, for control. That's dual power. In the same way, the Black Panther Party was not only feeding children, but they started opening up their own schools, non-governmental schools, not sanctioned by the government, not run by the government, and Black people were sending their children there. This was dual power. Black people had to, in that neighborhood, say, am I going to send my children to the government school, or am I going to send my children to the Liberation School, to the Black Panther Party school? And that was the decision that they had to make. And we were, the movement folks talking about we were fighting for legitimacy in the minds of people. And of course, then if people send their children to our schools and we had no teachers and we had no desks, then they wouldn't stay. They stayed because we had teachers, we had desks, and we had lessons, and the children were coming out better as a result. That is dual powers, when we build a competing and alternate structure. This is dual and competing powers. We're directly competing with the power structure. So if we go and say, look, we know that you are not getting fed properly by the government, by capitalism, we are going to feed you properly. Then we will be setting up dual power. That's only if we do it that way. The difference between a social service agency that's just handing out food, that is serving, and I'm not saying this to down social service agencies, we need them certainly inside of capitalism. But the difference is that with dual power, you are competing for power. In addition to giving out food, you are giving out political education. And you're saying the reason you're hungry is because of this state, because of this government, because of capitalism, because of white supremacy, because of patriarchy. And we want to overturn those systems and replace them with things that are just and things that will take care of our needs. Dual power is us setting up alternative and competing power structures where we deliver services, where we engage our people, and we say this is the way to come. This is your actual government in a real sense, rather than the United States government. That's dual power.
Yeah, because essentially, like you said, you're competing with the existing power structure that's there, and you're speaking to the needs of the people, the actual material needs of the people. And the next question: how can that dual power be built?
So great question. So I think it's going to have to be built in a couple of different ways. Obviously, the central way is organization, is we have to organize ourselves and organize our communities so that we can deliver these services that our communities need. And because we cannot compete with capitalism itself, we can't just hire everybody who comes in the door and say, make this burger or make this widget and deliver this widget over here. We have to engage people in a way that they would want to come in and participate in the process of delivering these services, of meeting these material needs. That means as organizations, we have to have clear ideology, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And what we're doing includes actual vying for power, actual competing for power. That has to be clear so that we're not lured into the thing of when someone comes and offers us a buyout that we're somehow have to have a discussion about whether or not we take it. When someone comes in and says that, why, that's not even on our plan. We have a plan here. That's not on our plan. That's not something that we're considering. We don't need to have a meeting for this. Someone could just out of hand say, no, this is not something we're considering, right? So having clear ideological, but then also having a clear plan on how we're going to implement the service or the action which we are going to take. And then we have to have the logistics in place. If we're serving food, we got to get the ingredients, and then we got to be able to prepare them. We have to train people on how to use the ingredients, on how to get the ingredients, and how to process them in a way that they don't go rotten, things like that. So we have to have all these systems in place, all this infrastructure in place, and we have to put it in place so that we can deliver services that people will come in and say, this is actually an improvement in my life. We can't say we're going to serve people food and then they get there and there's no food, or they get there and the food is rotten, or they get there and the place is closed. So we would need to build that by building our organization, and we'd have to include the people who are serving in the process of delivering those services. A lot of people are calling that mutual aid, but that's only mutual aid if it is direct involvement, not just handing food out. We need to involve people in the process of delivering those services.
Right. So I guess, well, I won't say that's background information, but I guess the question then becomes, when you do that, we've talked about the Panther programs, we've talked about different programs that people have created throughout time, not just even domestically, but even in other countries. But eventually, if you reach a certain critical mass, the state's not going to take kindly to you, and they're going to come for you. In the case of the Bolshevik Revolution, they were also armed and were willing to go to war over these things. But what happens when you build up your parallel programs and people like them, but then the propaganda inevitably comes out, similar to how it comes out in another country when they start building their own independent streak, and now the leader is a dictator, and we need to free them of the dictator, or there's some human rights violation that all of a sudden it pops up or something. So we see that similar here, where if you start doing something independently, all of a sudden there's this demonization that's going to come on a propaganda arm, and then there's also the actual physical repression that you will face. How do you deal with that? Because I think that's an inevitable outcome of trying to build dual power under capitalism.
So this is the essential part of being ideologically clear and having a plan. If you're ideologically clear that you're contending for power, then you know that no one gives up their power voluntarily or without a struggle. So the struggle is going to come for that power that you're trying to seize from those who currently have it. And if you're not ready for that, then you need to know that, and you need to plan accordingly. Then you do not have that level of confrontation. You do not have that level of antagonism. You do not have that level of competing if you're not ready for that. If you are ready for that, then you need to do the things that are necessary in order to protect yourself and your folks from the harm that could come from that direction. And we saw that happen very clearly, not just in other countries, but in the United States, where the FBI actually murdered Black Panther Party members who were armed. But were not quite prepared for the onslaught that came after them. So we would have to pace ourselves and increase the level of confrontation or antagonism in direct proportion with our capacity to deal with the backlash. So if we're not ready to deal with the backlash, then we need to put a cap on our level of antagonism and confrontation, lest we be completely crushed right away. And as we develop the capacity to actually compete for power in that way as well, then we need to be ready to expand that to. And that means we also have to be honest with the folks who are coming in and supporting. If people are coming in and they want to come in and help build things and deliver food, they need to know that this is what they're coming into, and they need them. Part of their job then is to prepare for that eventuality as well. That has to be part of the plan. If it's not part of the plan, then you're not serious about it.
Yeah, and I think that raises a fair point about just the times we're in. Has been a lot, and I think you're kind of seeing the results of what you just laid out on a broader scale. That in the 2010s there was a pushback on a lot of like conservative ideas, and I think on the idea side, people were winning. So people pushed back on trans antagonisms. People push back on just respectability politics in general. People push back on sexual assault, and primarily carried out by men, but not limited to them. People push back on police brutality. Like these were things that people were actively doing, but I don't think the people were prepared on any of those fronts and other ones as well for the backlash. So you escalate things and you try to make your issue the top thing for how people to discuss it, for people to discuss it, for people to care about it. But when the backlash comes, it's almost as if there wasn't even a plan to deal with it. So it's an interesting point in terms of just thinking about if you're willing to how far are you willing to escalate compared to how far can you deal? Because I do think there's a tendency to just say, that's some of the issues with when people say they want to raise awareness or, they want to consciousness raising or whatever. Like all of that's important, but it's just like there is an inevitable point where you're not just like a little, group of freaks in the corner to the state anymore. Now you are somewhat of a threat enough where you need to be put down, and like what is the program to even surviving that?
Exactly. And that goes back to our point about being serious. Building this dual power, you got to be prepared for the repression that does come. And if you're not prepared for that, then the people are going to go back to those liberal formations or those duopoly formations that already exist. And, essentially kind of lose the people again. Then you have to do it again to fight back, to get those people back to trying to form alternative structures to build that dual power.
Yeah, and I think when people hear this, I think it's like we need to have guns, and I'm not saying you shouldn't, but that becomes the only kind of solvent to them is we just need to be armed. But that's even if you study like military or whatever, like intelligence and understanding the environment and all of those things become just as important, if not more important, than how much weaponry.
Absolutely.
So it's not about just sitting in a bunker somewhere and being ready for the police to come to your door. Like you're not gonna win that battle likely. So that's probably so it's like,
and we use the example of the Black Panthers. They knew that. They knew the weapons weren't the end all be all. There's like there is actual other ideas, like you said, other organizations, other organizing efforts beyond that. There was other plans beyond that. It wasn't just about like the weapons, but a lot of times, a lot of our revolutionary and radical figures throughout history get reduced down to, especially Black Panthers, get reduced down to the weapons, the guns, the showmanship, the spectacle, or whatever. But there is definitely more than that. And again, back to building that dual power. That's what that's one thing. One of the reasons why Max, in your piece, you bring them up, and I think that was a great way of explaining the idea of dual power. But yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I guess yeah, I don't know. I could go on about that one because it's just again that what made those programs for all their, if you talk to the ones who are still living, they'll say they didn't get everything right either. But it's like what they did have was, the people were invested in them. And I think that, because I think correct me if I'm wrong, Max, part of the dual power broader strategy, I guess, is like you are you want the people to ultimately pick, what they want, and when it's taken from them, you want them to be able to engage in the fight. Or when the state tries to take it from them, you want them to be able to engage. If the people don't engage in that fight with you, and it's just the 10 organizers that put the program together, then well, you're not winning that, you know,
That's
anyway.
absolutely right.
You know.
Yeah, and Lenin talks about that in some kind of way, saying that what the state, what the traditional state of the capitalist state has is that they have overwhelming force, and so they get people to agree to the legitimacy of the government through force. So they have enough guns, they can say, so why do we show up to court? Because we know that they're going to come with guns if we don't. So it has nothing to do with the fact that we think that they're just or wise or fair. It has to do that we don't want them coming with a bunch of guns to our mama house looking for us. So that's why we end up going to court. But Lenin said that the way that we can win here, though, is not by competing on the force part. We have to actually fight for legitimacy in people's minds. That they say that this is a movement that I'm a part of, that I see myself in, and that I want to join. I think that would be the same thing that the Black Panther Party was very deliberate about that. What they said was that we want to create a situation where when the government comes after them, millions of people rise up and say, you know what, that's where my kid gets breakfast. That's where my kid goes to school. I actually have to come and defend that. And I'm not going to let the people who are denying my kid breakfast come and destroy the place where my kid is getting food breakfast.
Right. Right. Closing out, I know I'm not giving you enough time. What might have to bring you back to talk about this, but I did want to ask. This isn't on our sheet, but we talked about it. You had devised this thing called the most chart, and I know that takes way more than 15 minutes, so I'm not asking you to give us a full breakdown of it. But for those who are really trying to get to that level, I'm thinking about how to implement this, like how to implement dual power or whatever else they're working on. I've found it useful to help sort out ideas and to keep people on the same page. And so people have a lot of ideas about what they think they're doing when they will enter into an organization. And often I've always said a lot of people don't join for the mission statement. People come in for all kinds of reasons. So getting folks on at least a similar page is important to getting work done and coordinating. And I found the most chart to be helpful to do that. So if you could, I guess, just explain kind of the broader theory of it. Again, I know there's not enough time to get into the nuances of everything, but I don't know if there's a way you could just kind of speak to the broader theory of it for folks, and
Sure.
and I know you're developing it further, but if you could think
Well,
about it.
as a longtime organizer, one of the challenges that we have had is that new people come into a space, and then they have to be oriented and get up to speed about what we're working on and how we're thinking about something. In one of the projects that I worked on, we had a very high profile situation where we were concerned that we would get raided by the police at any moment, which of course eventually did happen. And one of the scenarios that we laid out was, okay, what if they take us and they take all of us and they put us in different rooms, and then they make us each a different offer, a different sellout offer, or a different statement? How do we make sure that everyone has the same answer, at least roughly the same answer? And the only way to do that is not to practice every possible question that they could ask you, but to have a clear way of thinking about what we're working on that everyone agrees with. Even if you agree with every 100% of it, you agree that that's what we're working on, that's what we agreed on, and that they know very well, they know back and forth. So I think that was one of the scenarios we wanted to play out, so that if you have the right algorithm, then any questions or any problems that come in through that, you just work it through the algorithm and you'll get a similar answer at the end. And it's true in math, and it should also be true in organizing, and it is. And then the other one is that when we onboard new people, we get folks who are joining into something, whether it's a plan to organize an event, whether it's a large campaign, whether it's an organization. How do we get people on the same page to know what they're fighting for, to know what they're working on? And I think one of the big problems with organizing that we have, particularly in this country, is that people join an organization because they are upset about something, angry about something, and against something, but they're not really clear what the outcome is. So let's say you go in and you win, it goes taken to its natural conclusion and you win. What is it that you're actually winning? Do we know that? Do we clear about that? I think that's a major problem we have in organizing. How do we resolve some of those issues? The way we resolve it is to have a strategic plan that everyone can see, everyone can access, and everyone can manipulate, contribute to, and say, this is what the strategic plan is. And then when things deviate from the strategic plan, everyone knows it because there's the strategic plan. And when things go according to the strategic plan, then everyone knows it because there is the strategic plan. Everyone sees what it is. And that is really the motivation behind building a way to. And of course, we want to do this in a scientific way as movement scientists. We want to say we want to do this in a scientific way, in a way that makes sense, in a way that works and works in a number of different situations. So what we created was a system called the MOST. And the MOST, of course, is an acronym that stands for mission, objectives, strategies, and tactics. And there will be for every level of organization, whether it's an organization, whether it's a movement or an organization in a movement, or a department inside of an organization, inside of a movement, or a campaign or program inside of a department, inside of an organization, inside of a movement. Every level of these can and should have a strategic plan. That strategic plan would be called a MOST. So the first part of the MOST would be a mission statement. A mission statement would kind of be like your moonshot, right? Like your big picture. What is it that we're trying to accomplish? In a big picture sense, it can and should be a bit vague and really big picture and even ambitious. And then the objective, however, is always going to be a bit too big to kind of like wrap your head around in terms of what's the actual work. So that has to be brought down another level, and those will be the objectives or the ways in which we're going to execute or the ways in which we're going to live the mission. So we can have multiple objectives, and you should have multiple objectives as a way of achieving or living the mission. But then those objectives aren't enough either. You then have to have a way of implementing or winning the objectives, and those would be the strategies. So each objective could have multiple and should have multiple strategies. And then you put those strategies into play, and that's how you win. And then the particular ways in which you carry out the strategies, those would be the tactics. And each of those areas are embedded in the other. They're all nestled inside of each other, and they all come together, make one system. And then people can see not only the work that they're doing. So in other words, you could have someone in the organization who's just working on one strategy and a series of tactics inside of the strategist, and they can see clearly what they're doing and why. But they can also see what everyone else is doing. So why is sweeping the floor so important to this program? You can then look at other parts of the strategic plan, and you can say, okay, if I don't sweep the floor here, then we're going to have a serious problem in some of those other areas. So this is actually a critical part of the plan, and so I have to do this, and I have to do this well. So it is about creating strategic plans that everyone can see and that we can objectively measure ourselves by. We can then also go back at the end of whatever the time period is or whatever the natural endpoint is and say, okay, did we do what we said we were going to do? And if we did not, why not? And if we did, then how do we continue down this path? And then the last thing I want to say is that by having a strategic plan written and in advance, it's also the best way to know when someone has sold you out. So this is a major problem that we have now with movements where people jump out and go to and I'm not saying you shouldn't go, but there's a police shooting and people go to the streets and they protest, and then they join the organization who put together the protests, which is great. But then they're not clear about what the strategies and objectives are of this organization. So this is not to pick on anyone, but just to point out an obvious problem. If the only thing you know about the organization is that they insist that Black Lives Matter, then you have a big rally, you have a big march, and the state calls in the leadership and says, look, we're ready to make a deal. And then they come out and they tell you what the deal is. Some people are going to love the deal. Some people are going to hate it. How are you going to demonstrate that this person is sold? Have they sold you out? Maybe they didn't sell you out. But how would you demonstrate? How would you know whether they sold you out or not? The only way is to look at what you were supposed to achieve, what everyone agreed on that you're supposed to achieve, and you did achieve it or you didn't achieve it. That's the only way to know. And if you don't have that, then there's actually no way to say this group of people sold us out or this people did not. That's the part that we have to get. Having a strategic plan in advance is a critical part of organizing, and we need to have that.
I love that.
Yeah, I think
yeah,
because it's like I mean, especially to the point about selling out, but yeah, I mean that's why I've learned through this and through other formations. Like when you get involved, you have to ask people what are And people get mad sometimes when you ask that question, but what is the mission? What are the objectives? What are we trying to do? Can we get that on paper? Because I think that there's a universal understanding of what's in their head. And there's probably never a universal understanding of what's in your head. So
No,
so it's like you're better
never.
to it's better to actually talk that through and to see step by step. And I think when you talk about strategies and tactics, particularly, a lot of folks think tactics are the mission. You know what I
Mm,
mean? So like if I'm gonna go and confront the police by standing in the street and like it looks bold and radical, but like what is this tied to? You
hmm
know, like Ryan knows I always ask this question and stuff when people have ideas. I'm like, okay, if we do this, what are we trying to achieve?
hmm
Like, because we can do a lot of stuff, but what is the goal? What are we trying to achieve? How is that tied to what we're already working on? If how does that bring us closer to our goal? Or is it just something that feels very bold and fresh and new, but it actually has no strategic value to what we want to do? And a lot of
Exactly.
times, yeah, the tactics become this big show because that's what people are actually, I would say
Yes,
that's what you're
yes,
visually going to see, but the tactics have to be tied to something else. If I go and stand in the street to try to block the road, you know, I could be doing that for all kinds of reasons, but blocking the road in and of itself isn't going to get someone out of prison, isn't going to get food in
no,
someone's mouth in and of itself. Like there's nothing else tied to it. But a lot of times there's this hot potato approach to activism and organizing where I'm going to do it and then somebody's going to catch the vibe and they're going to go do it. So I'm going to raise the point and then you're going to catch the vibe
no, you're
and the
right.
Messiah will come or something, right? Like that's
And
and it yeah.
and the vibe itself becomes the whole objective, right? The people want it to come and be involved in these so-called bold acts, and they get addicted to being in these bold acts. But like you said, there's no kind of actual, if nothing else is behind it, then it's just really it's an empty gesture at the end of the day. And also, I mean, Max, to your point, but adding a most chart and adding, you know, putting things in paper, we've learned from experiences, me and Black, that as soon as you add the structure to that, people who are not for you will dissipate. They'll
Yeah.
fade away.
Yes.
Yeah.
They will.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll do it before you even have to put anything, even that conversation of like, hey, we're gonna implement this. They'll be like, why? Asking a bunch of
Rules?
questions.
Yeah.
And then
Principles? Like
you're like,
no.
what? You mean we can't just go on doing what we've been doing? It's like, no, we gotta put this on
No.
paper.
Let me
And
tell
then
you,
that weeds out the people as well.
Yeah.
strategic plans is a foolproof sucker repellent. It will repel suckers from your campaign.
Yeah, because it's like they don't, and you have to stick to them as well.
That's
Like,
it.
you know,
It
you
creates
got to stick
accountability.
to
You're
it.
no longer out there,
Yeah.
doing whatever, doing your own thing. You can actually then go back to the next meeting and say, you did this, but look at our strategic plan. It said you were supposed to do that. And you didn't do that, you did this. And therefore
Mhm,
you are aligned. Let's talk about accountability. And
Yeah.
there's no explaining it. There's no, smooth talking your way out of it. It's right there. It was agreed upon in advance. This is
Yeah.
a sucker repellent, I'm telling you.
Yeah. Like, because you go out and you wanted to give a speech. I mean, I've even been able to use this to talk people off the ledge sometimes where they're not happy with where we're at. I'm like, okay, well, let's go back to what we've agreed upon. Because like you told me, it's a living document. It's not like when you write out the most chart.
Yeah.
If the plan sucks, if you wrote out a bad plan, you can always tweak it. You know, you're not like burdened by it, but you still have to go back and tweak it. You don't get to just be like, all right, this sucks. So now I'm just gonna go stand in the street.
Yeah, I
Like
think we've
that's
also found it useful, months or a year down the road when we are unhappy about some areas we've gone to go back and look, okay, we planned this 6 months ago, 3 months ago, a year ago, whenever, and we made decisions here. We decided we're going to accomplish these things, but we can't do everything at the same time. So doing this meant that we weren't going to get that.
hmm
So, we went to, you went to the cookout and now you're mad you didn't go to the movie, but we said we're going to go to the cookout. So we gave, and if we would have went to the movies, you'd now be mad that we weren't at the cookout. So we made some decisions, and we're sticking to those decisions.
Right. Yeah. Again, we could do a whole episode on that one because I just feel like it.
I am waiting for the invitation.
Yeah, we might have to do that one because I just feel like that needs to be fleshed out more for folks because it's like,
on some more Google documents, I want to start putting parentheses the sucker repellent. I think the most. I'm gonna start doing that now.
I mean, it does really make people nervous sometimes. Like it's like like I don't want to really get involved with that. So, yeah, but I do think it puts us in some kind of it's a contract in a way too because this is what you say we agreed to and it's laid out. Like.
What's interesting about the fact that some people don't want to get into that, not to use too many sports metaphor, but nobody would pay to go watch a football game or a basketball game if the players went out there and they're like, I know we practiced all week, but I kind of feel like doing this today. And they just did whatever they wanted. And what we're doing is far more complex than playing.
And those are usually bad. Those are usually bad teams. Those are the
bad teams. Everybody wants to be the quarterback, so nobody's blocking. Yeah. So good. Or we agree that when I call this play, you run this pattern, and I felt like running the other pattern. Okay, well, we can't win that way. And if those are the standards that you hold your sports teams to, you should hold your political team to at least the same standards. We make a plan, we practice the plan, we execute the plan. If we do all those first two, and then you show up and you do whatever you want, then what you on the team for?
Yeah, all that freelancing shit, all that, I'm gonna will the thing, and then and then a lot of times that ends up creating more problems because you're gambling, So, and sometimes gamblers don't realize that they're gambling. So when something goes well for them, they're like, well, it worked then, but it's like, yeah, but your process is gambling. Like you're a gambler. So the next time we're going to take a major L and then we do it, I'm like, I told you, you're a gambler. Like stop gambling.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like you gotta have some discipline with it. Even if you're going to gamble, like there's discipline in gambling, but like, you're just out here. All right, I'm going to put a 5,000 on this and it's going to come back 10,000. And the next day you lose 20,000, like it doesn't, you can't, and like Ryan said earlier, we're talking about people's lives here. So you want to gamble on sports, have fun, I guess. But this is like people's lives. Like we can't just, play around with with how we do that. So anyway, I hope this series of episodes clarifies this myth for people. Thanks again for coming on, Max, and walking us through this. Yep. And we'll be back. We got more episodes in the loading and more stuff to be done, so we'll be back soon. But peace out and yeah.
Okay. Fresh out the plane in a whole nother state. I'm trying to eat down a whole nother plate. Seem like my homies was stuck in a